getting ready here. And we're good. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on our Tuesday evening here. I cannot thank you guys enough for joining us. This is, part of our continued series here at Tattered Cover, our virtual events series. For those of you who might not know, my name is McKaylee. I work at Tattered Cover Bookstore, which is located in Denver, Colorado. If this is your first time at one of our live stream events, thank you for joining us. Welcome. We're so excited to have you guys. We've been hosting virtual events since March and we're going to continue doing it probably into 2021. So you can go ahead and hit that subscribe button, as most of our events are going to be streaming here through our YouTube channel. And for those of you who may have been watching before, welcome back. Thank you for joining us again. You kind of know how this works. I hope you're not sick of my face quite yet. But we have great and exciting new events coming up every single week. Like tomorrow, we have an event. It's a little bit earlier in the day at 3:30 p.m., but you can have it on at work if you can still watch. And it's going to be Chef Chris Kimball from Milk Street. And that'll be a really fun event. He's going to whip up some amazing new recipes from his new book for us. And we have events going into November as well. And you can always go on our website at tatteredcover.com to check those out. Also, if you are in the Denver metro area, you can visit one of our 4 locations. We are currently open right now. Denver has moved up to a level 3, and so right now we are not at a stay-at-home order yet. So you can still come in if you'd like, making sure that you wear your mask over your nose and your mouth, and then you can stay for about 90 minutes or so in any of our locations, shopping and browsing, getting your Christmas shopping done early or any other holiday, birthday shopping, gift cards. We got it all there. Or if you want to stay in the comfort of your own home, in the comfort of your pajamas, our website's open 24/7, and you can do all your shopping online at tatteredcover.com. Well, enough about Tattered Cover and our shopping hours and everything that you need. I do want to let anybody know, though, before we get started here, that closed captioning is enabled on this video. So if you would like to, all you have to do is, on the screen that you're watching me on right now, hover your mouse over it, and there's a little button that says CC at the bottom. Click that button and closed captioning will be enabled if you want it or need it. So now, our woman of the hour here, I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. We have the author Naomi Wolf, who's with us today, and her book Outrages. And Naomi Wolf's most recent books include the New York Times bestsellers Vagina, Give Me Liberty, and The End of America, as well as the landmark bestseller The Beauty Myth. She's completed a doctorate in English language and literature from the University of Oxford in 2015 and has taught at the George Washington University and Stony Brook University. Wolf currently lives in New York City, and I am so happy to welcome author Naomi Wolf. And I'm going to have her turn on her camera and her microphone here so she can join me.
Hey.
Oh.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for joining us on this Tuesday. We're so happy to have you.
I'm so happy to be here. I was sharing earlier the incredible memories I have going back to the 90s of the magical Tattered Cover. And I'm just thrilled and honored to be in dialogue with Tattered Cover, even, in this virtual way. So I'm very happy to be talking to all of you.
Well, Tattered Cover actually turns 50 years old in 2021, believe it or not. So lots of people have many decades worth of memories. And I'm so happy to hear that you're one of them. We were sharing our stories before we went live here. And it's really just something so magical that a bookstore has touched so many lives. And so thank you for helping us continue to do that. And we're excited to have you and create more memories.
Good. So thrilled.
Yeah. So why don't you start us off, right, with what is this new book about? And if you could give us a summary and just kind of, start us off here before, in case anybody doesn't know about the book or hasn't read it yet, what's Outrages about?
I'd love to. So Outrages is the story of a man who should be world famous, but isn't yet. I hope that with Outrages and other people writing and learning about him, he'll become better and better known. His name is John Addington Symonds, and he is an amazing pioneer of the LGBTQ rights movement. He wrote the first manifesto for LGBTQ rights in English. And his story is, and he was also a great believer in love and in the nobility and beauty or the way he saw the nobility and beauty of love between men specifically. And his life is incredibly poignant and inspiring because he had the misfortune to come of age at a time when Britain, where he was born, had a very, very restrictive and increasingly restrictive set of laws around sexual contact between men and also around speech. So he grew up as a young poet and he fell in love, just at the moment when any consummation of that love was a capital offense till he was 21, and had sentences of hard labor after that, for sodomy. And also at a time when, after 1857, when he was 17, there was a law called the Obscene Publications Act, which restricted any speech about sexuality, again, with sentences at hard labor. So really, in Outrages, not only is he a hero, but people like you are heroes, and the people at the Tattered cover, because booksellers and printers and publishers were in the front lines of these new laws against speech. They were going to prison. They were serving sentences at hard labor. It's a hidden history that's really important. So not only did he kind of come of age with this struggle, but what's beautiful about him is that he tried his whole life, as it became more and more dangerous, to tell his truth about the beauty of same-sex relationships, when it was like so criminal. And he did it in code, or he did it changing the pronouns, so he wouldn't get arrested but could still publish his love poetry. Or he wrote about men in history whom today we would call gay, like Michelangelo Buonarroti, that was safe because they were dead. It was a historical figure. Or he actually, it's amazing, like a literary detective novel, he actually embedded clues in his books of poems for the future, so that when you crack the code and you put sets of poems together, the actual love affair between himself and the great love of his life, Angelo Fusato, a gondolier, kind of springs into life. So he's an incredible parable of, the belief in love and the belief in words at a time when that was so dangerous. And then very briefly, and then I'll pause.
We're all listening. We're wrapped.
He was inspired his whole life by a correspondence with Walt Whitman. He kind of fell in love with him long distance. They never met. But again, this is so beautiful. For decades, he pestered Walt Whitman, who was what we would call a gay writer. The language didn't exist then in the same way. He pestered Whitman to be more out, as we would say, about the homoerotic content in his poems. And Whitman always kind of resisted being that literal, but it's amazing to watch this inspiration across the Atlantic, these two great souls who never met, but Whitman's courage really inspiring and giving moral support to this, tubercular, fragile, conventional British upper middle class poet, surrounded by much darker laws and restrictions. And then the last important thing I think about Outrages and why it's so timely right now is that, not only is it important for the story of this hero who just would not shut up about love and who, managed to send this LGBTQ rights manifesto into the future, to a future he would never live to see. But it also shows how new laws around censorship, as I mentioned, laws invading personal privacy, getting into your bedroom, examining people's bodies with examples that are quite chilling. The British state was seizing women off the street and forcing vaginal exams on them if they thought they were prostitutes, and then later invading the bodies of men accused of sodomy, in similarly intrusive ways. So you see this kind of metastasizing of the power of the state at a time when the modern state was really kind of inventing these new powers as a secular entity, right? And so we inherit this. We inherit the assumption that the state has a role in policing speech, right? Less so in America, but calls for censorship are rising up. And all over Western Europe, this is happening, and all over Canada and all over the world, there are calls for censorship arising again. And also we kind of take for granted that the state has a role in invading the body, like whether it's abortion, at what point do you not allow the state to interfere? Or do you allow the state to interfere? Or whether it's, policing what gender trans people can call themselves, or at what point in Britain, their transitioning is, incredibly intrusive management of our bodies. And what this book shows is that these powers were really invented at a time when new groups were clamoring for equality and for rights and access to power. So it's one of those backlash moves by the state to control people, using the excuse of obscenity and the excuse of, sodomy between men is the worst thing anyone could ever do, as a way to crack down on everyone. So that, obviously I'm just noting we're in a time when there's a huge amount of, calls to manage speech and bodies in a whole bunch of new ways. And so I think the book's very timely in like asking us to think critically about that.
Absolutely. But I definitely want to hit on what this book means in the modern day. But I have to go back and wonder, how the heck did you find the man Simmons in the first place? Like, when did you discover who he was, and what about him sparked the interest that led to this book eventually? How did he enter your life?
That is a great question, McKaylee. And I was so lucky. I went back to school as a middle-aged lady. When I was 48, I went back to graduate school. I know.
Yes.
And I was like literally sitting in classes with 21-year-olds and feeling very, humble and happy to be able to complete my education. And I had a fantastic advisor named Stefano Evangelista, who's a very respected LGBTQ literary history scholar. He wrote a book called British Aestheticism in Ancient Greece. And it's about how gay men in Victorian England used tropes of talking about Greece, classical antiquity, as a way to talk about homosexuality without getting arrested, basically. And also, if you think back, British schoolboys were being told constantly in the 19th century how vile and criminal and amoral sex between men was. However, they were reading Plato and, the Phaedrus. And so as schoolboys, they were coming in contact with these beautiful texts from classical antiquity that said beautiful things about love between men. And they were very moved and inspired by them. And it was a contradiction, which, changed the lives of many, many boys, because they couldn't believe that, what the dominant society was saying was true if Plato said otherwise. And the Greeks were held up as this cultural authority. So Stefano Evangelista handed me one day, he knew I was interested in, Victorian codes of sexuality, because I've always been interested in the history of sexuality. I wrote about it in Vagina and in Promiscuities. Like, how did we get to the taboos that we have? How did we get to the stereotypes that we have about gender? Fascinates me. So he said, you've got to read about John Addington Symonds. And he gave me the first of 3 gigantic green tomes. I'm just going to ignore that.
That's totally fine. It happens. We all think about shutting off our cell phones and not the landlines, darn it. No, go ahead. First of 3.
He handed me this first of 3 tomes, and they were Symonds letters. And, by the time I was, just a few letters in, I was hooked, because he starts as a boy, right? And you see him growing into being 16, 17, 18 years old, falling in love for the first time with another youth, another teenager whom he calls W. And you have all of this moving description of first love, and it's so recognizable and universal, right? And like moving. And I had a teenage boy at the time. I was the mother of a boy who was a teenager at the time. So it was very, very recognizable to me. And then you just feel like you know what's coming. You feel the shadow awaiting him. And then you see in real time as he realizes, I mean, it gives me chills even now. You see him at 19, 20, 21, as a college student, realizing that there is no future for this love. He can never get married to the people he's actually attracted to, the man he loves. He can never be public. You know, his father's like shaming him, and and so then by the time he's 21, he takes this beautiful love poem, which goes on for pages and pages and pages, called In Memoriam Arcady, that he wrote to W, right? And he takes it, and by the time he's 21, he writes a preface disavowing it, right? A set apology, saying nothing that follows should you take as being true. It didn't happen. It's just a metaphor. It's not sexual. But what happened that year is that long sentences at hard labor were allowed to be given for the kind of intimacy he had with W. So that's just the beginning of a life in which he was torn between wanting to express and needing to repress. I mean, he, over and over again, this happened. He wrote these, secret sodomy poems when he was in his, 30s and 40s, and he kept them in a locked box in his study. And, his friends were saying, you have to get rid of these because it was illegal to read them, right? His friends could go to jail for receiving them. So he goes with his best friend to the River Avon, and he takes the key to the locked box and he throws away the key, but not the box, into the river. And for me as a writer, that's so moving. Like, what a metaphor of a conflicted, writer and lover. He won't throw away these secret poems that tell his truth, but that are so dangerous for him to even keep in his home, let alone share with anyone. So that's how I found Simmons. And of course, as readers are finding, once you are introduced to this extraordinary man, he's absolutely unforgettable and addictive.
So then it seems like that it's funny because I studied English. I mentioned I was a theater major, also an English major. I don't know who this person is. And yet you seem to have all of this research and this information about him. So where did you start? From this man that's supposedly unknown, how did your research process start and where did it go?
Absolutely. So here's what I have learned in this journey. History is really written by the dominant culture, and there are many, I mean, this is a cliche now. It's like a year of this issue coming to the fore, who writes history. But even when I started my research on Simmons 8 years ago, I didn't realize how much, even in literary history, histories are elided and erased and left behind. I knew about erasing Native American history. I knew about erasing African American history. I was astonished. You said you were an English major. I was an English major. I've read all the things, and I had no idea that the high point of the persecution of gay men, people we would call gay men in Britain, didn't start with the Labouchere Amendment and the Oscar Wilde trial, which is the story we're told, right? And by the same token, I knew only vaguely that Stonewall wasn't the beginning of the gay rights movement, the LGBTQ rights movement. I knew vaguely that it went back to the 50s, but I had no idea that there were sexual dissidents 130 years ago, articulating a claim for the, naturalness and nobility and the equal rights of people to love people of the same gender. So you see that happening with, the women's movement. I knew about the second wave. I kind of knew about the first wave, not till I did this research. And I'm a career feminist, right? Did I know that the woman question was the biggest the biggest issue in 19th century Britain and America, and that all of the things we think are new with the second wave, from abortion to prostitution to domestic violence to custody issues and women's right to own their own property, they'd already articulated in the first wave. So I my mind was blown, of course, but I was at a university with a very great library, and there are very important LGBTQ legal history scholars who have done very important work on this field that are not popularized, right? So sadly, misinformation about kind of downplaying how badly persecuted gay men were, for instance, in the 19th century, is everywhere. And there was a lot of it last spring when this book was kind of famously attacked. And I did get a couple of things wrong, which this edition corrects. But what's really sad is that misinformation erasing, for instance, the fact that there were dozens of executions of gay men or of men for sodomy in the 19th century, that really happened, right? Whereas if you're just reading the Huffington Post or, blogs from that time, you would think that it hadn't. It's not true, it's misinformation. But the actual history is often behind a paywall in the work of H.G. Cox, in the work of Paul Johnson of York University, in the work of Graham Robb, Charles Upchurch. So in this edition, I shine even more light on the work of these really incredible, important LGBTQ history scholars and also medical history scholars who shine a light on this whole period of persecution of gay men, legal persecution that my literary education had elided. So it's there, but part of my job with Outrages is to bring that important work forward and really do everything I can to shine a light on it.
And so when you talk about that of bringing things forward and this misinformation, so how did you decide what to bring forward? You know what I mean? You only had a book, right? You don't have tomes upon tomes to tell the history of this. So how did you decide what to focus on? And did you look at it as more of a narrative following his life? What led you to really kind of hone in on specific parts and specific things having to do with Simmons,
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I can tell that you've talked to a lot of writers about their books because that's a question about structure, and it's structure is so important in a great work of, I aspire to write great works of nonfiction and
right, fiction, nonfiction. You have to have some sort of flow to the book, otherwise it's just a textbook.
Or a muddle, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly, or a mess.
Yeah, so you're asking a great question. I love it. It's the structure nerd in me gets really excited. So readers of Outrages will find that, so first of all, this book is a rewrite of my doctoral thesis. So I had to take the findings in my doctoral thesis and retell them for a popular audience and make it not academic. I mean, academic backed up by all the research, but
yes, absolutely
fun to read, right? And but what you'll see is that the story of Simmons' life and of the sexual dissidents, quote unquote, around him does form the narrative spine, and they're fascinating people. I mean, it's not just Simmons, it's Annie Besant, an incredible early feminist who was tried under the Obscene Publications Act for having dared to give a pamphlet about how women can control their reproductive lives to working class women. Because of this, she was tried and found to be an unfit mother, and her custody of her 8-year-old daughter, Mabel, was taken away from her, right? So she was one of the people around Simmons. Other amazing people like Simeon Solomon, the artist whose beautiful image is on the cover of Outrages, this Chelsea Green edition, so beautiful. He was arrested twice for soliciting sodomy, and his career, ended as a result of that. And I thought you were going to hold up the book, but that's okay.
No, sorry.
So and Whitman, of course, and how Whitman was excised and Bowdlerized, and then how people used to risk, again, getting in a lot of trouble to hand unexpurgated copies of Leaves of Grass, this homoerotic poem especially, to their friends in Britain. So the structure follows that kind of group biography, but at the same time, I lay underneath them the laws that were changing. And you could see, it's like a palimpsest. You could see how these laws affected people's daily lives so profoundly, and affected British literature and then American literature, because after 1873, America was watching this. We had our own pressures to reform and claims for equality and, demands for equal rights from women and from people of color and so on. And so, not coincidentally, in 1873, in spite of the First Amendment, the Comstock Law was passed, which criminalized, free speech crossing state borders. So you can see the chill, right? And so what I did was really, first I found out about the 1857 Obscene Publications Act, and that just completely blew my mind because, again, I'm an English major, right? English graduate student. We're taught that the Victorians were modest or, embarrassed about sexual issues. We cannot know that because after 1857, it was illegal to write or speak about sexual matters at all. Like booksellers were serving time in prison at hard labor for selling, Zola's Nana, right? I mean, so that was incredible to me. And then when I saw that, I started to look at other laws, that criminalized same-sex offenses, but also other laws against speech, and then laws that were exported around the world, like the 1873 Indian Penal Code that criminalized homosexuality all over the world in British colonies that had no innate grassroots culture of homophobia. And that had such a lasting legacy that India 2 years ago just repealed Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, criminalizing male homosexuality. So it was incredible for me to see these lives kind of striated by these laws, and to see how these laws, once you start, keep metastasizing, because the state likes to control human beings. It profits those in power, and especially the state was innovating, as you and I were discussing, with controlling speech and controlling what you do in private. And the state really kind of invented in 19th century in Britain and exported to America this idea that what you do in the privacy of your home affects me, or what you read in the privacy of your computer or your book that you buy at your bookstore affects me. Like, that's a crazy idea, from an Enlightenment perspective. Why should I care who you're sleeping with, right? Or what gender you call yourself, or what book you're reading? It is none of my business. But the state managed to create a trope, and I go into exactly why this is in Outrages, that persuaded us that I'm affected, my whatever nuclear family is affected by, your orgy, or vice versa. And it is absolute madness.
And so, and I love how I want to compliment you on how impassioned and emboldened you are when talking about this, because one, as again, fellow English nerd, like, you get very impassioned when you think about research and the things that you've studied for so long. You mentioned it was 8 years. I'm curious if, you've been able to see this for so long, if you were able to not predict, that's the wrong word, but like, if you could see in your research of the past how it's still being influenced today, and especially in 2020, how explosive it's been in the matters of censorship, rights for those in marginalized identities. If you were able to kind of pick up the pieces of how that's still related today, about how those voices were still being oppressed and still fighting for the right to speak and share their stories. I'm just curious about, having studied it for so long, how that impacts how you see the world, and how that impacts today's world, and your view on it.
That's another so important question, especially right now, because you're right, explosive is the word. Well, I mean, Outrages really does have answers to these questions. I don't know, many of the viewers may be familiar with my book, The End of America, which Chelsea Green, my current publisher, also published at a time in 2007 when I was told that it would end my career if I wrote and published The End of America. It was a 10-month New York Times bestseller. And I mentioned it because it predicts exactly where we are today. It says there could be fascism in America, and here's how it will come about if we are not careful. And literally everything I predicted, sadly, is right where we are. I mean, so much so that I've been writing a series of essays and videos, doing videos called Step 10, because we're at 10, step 10 of the 10 steps to fascism. So outrage
makes me think about how much of a historian you are, of that, if we don't study our history, we're doomed to repeat it. Like, that's really what the quote was in my head as I was trying to form this question. And
yeah, absolutely.
Curious how that studies bring you into your views of today.
Absolutely. And then if you don't have access to all of your history, or you don't even know what's missing, that disempowers you, dramatically. But I think about Outrages, as I may have mentioned, as the prequel to The End of America. It's like, how did these begin? So let me give you just two examples from the book, and then I'll move to the current moment. So, I'm a rape survivor, which I've started to talk about since the Me Too movement, unfortunately. And as a Western woman, I have always been aware that women in the West have a vague sense that if, God forbid, they're raped, there's a scale of like virgin or nun to prostitute, and that there's somewhere, their circumstances will place them somewhere on that scale, and then the state will treat them and, in relation to their rape, better or worse, more or less protectively, depending on where on the nun to prostitute scale they happen to be trapped at the moment of being raped. Were you dressed too improperly? Were you seductive in some way? Were you drinking? Were you having too much fun? Are you sexually experienced? God forbid, right?
But did you ask for it? Yeah.
Did you ask for it? Exactly. Which again is one of those completely insane questions, right? But they're deeply part of our heritage. So I found exactly where it came from. Like the trauma, the multi-generational trauma arises, I'm absolutely convinced, in the West from the Contagious Diseases Acts, 1864 to 1868, when the British state was worried about the fact that its navy and soldiers had a lot of venereal diseases. So instead of dealing with the men, they criminalized the women, and the state passed laws that gave the state, like magistrates, the power to seize women off the street, like literally kidnap them off the street if they looked like they might be prostitutes. What does that mean, right? Looking like a prostitute. See where this phobia, this anxiety, this trauma comes from. If they're dressed too seductively or too brightly or too provocatively, if they're pretty young women, if they're flirting, if they're out with a male friend or a male relative, if they've had a drink, right? If they're out too late. All of these women were abducted, I am not making this up, and taken to what were called lock hospitals. And there the state forced vaginal exams, as I mentioned, on them. And again, as a rape survivor, that is some trauma, when your body is invaded against your will. And then they're kept for like up to 9 months in a state of forced obedience and unable to look after their kids if they have them, their reputations in ruins, their professions derailed, or their jobs lost, because nominally they had to be treated for venereal disease or just like broken, So this was happening. And again, metastasizing laws. It started in a few port towns, and then more and more were added. So of course, mistakes were made. Nice women were abducted, middle-class women were abducted, right? And so amazingly, and I doubt you were taught this, I wasn't either, the very first feminist organizing in the world came about in opposition to these Contagious Diseases Acts. And the first spokeswoman, Josephine Butler, a famous woman, not taught to us almost at all anymore, gave the first speeches, the first groups, the first petitions to Parliament to end, or the first petitions to Parliament around sexual issues like this, to end these practices. It was very, very effective. So that's just one example of how the history recounted in Outrages literally affects us to this day. Like, I can't tell you, when I worked at a rape crisis center, how many, I literally remember being at a rape trial where the victim's sexy underwear were held up by the prosecutor, as if like, well, why wouldn't you rape her? Look at how this bright red underwear. I kid you not, right?
My head's gonna explode.
Right?
Okay.
But so this comes from somewhere. It comes from the Contagious Diseases Acts, and we still live with it. Another example is, I mentioned these anal exams that, I'm sorry to get graphic, but I assume we're all adults here. That, taking a leaf basically from the Contagious Diseases Act, and you see the state doing this, like, oh, this worked to control this group of people who are clamoring for their rights. Let's move on to another group. So men identified as passive sodomites. The term gay didn't exist at that time the same way. The identity wasn't in common discourse in the same way. But men accused of sodomy would be tried, and in the trials, their anuses would be examined by venereologists. And there was a mythology based on, a book by a guy named Auguste Tardieu that said there are 6 signs of the passive sodomite. His anus looks one of these 6 ways, right? So, and you see the echo of like, okay, we invaded the body of the woman. Now we're going to invade the body of these targeted men. So the shame.
That psychology that was like, that could tell based on the bumps of your head. Like, that's what it feels like. They could like tell your personality by how your head was shaped. That's how about scientific it feels.
Or a witch mark, right? The way they used to look, for witches in the Salem witch trial, like, oh, you have a birthmark on your body. That must be a devil's teat,
Yes.
So this was done to men, and Simmons was literally terrified in the 1870s when this began to be done in Sodomy Trials. And one of the subtitles of his great manifesto for equal rights for gay people is he directs himself to medical jurists, right? Mm-hmm. to people providing medical testimony and to jurists. So he's imprinted with this spectacle of the shame, the invasiveness, and also just the fear. Like imagine what it does to you if you want to consummate a relationship with your male lover and you're a man through the act of sodomy, and there's a mythology that can be seen on you and send you to prison, right, at hard labor, and be reported in the papers, right? So this, I think, I'm a cultural historian or a cultural critic, and I have to notice that men of all sexualities were the brighter and more decorative people in terms of their costumes than women for most of human history, until right after this period. And then you get the business suit, which is like black or navy blue, and the top hat, and all the men are dressing identically. And you get this hyper, these very rigid norms of masculinity, which didn't exist in the same way till after that decade. And, the joke I cite in Outrages is, when a man like whacks another man 3 times on the shoulder, it's like, I'm not gay, right? Instead of embracing. So this phobia that straight men have, or men of, they're not sure about their sexuality may have, especially when they're young, of what if they think I'm gay, right? Like, why should that be so terrifying? Why should that be so terrifying? And honestly, I think some of that terror and some of that, that your 4-year-old dresses in pink and blue, pink and purple,
yeah,
till he's 4, and then suddenly he realizes he can't do that anymore, and he doesn't want you to, he has to put that away because he's a boy. Where does that come from, right? And I have to believe, I'm not a man, but I think that homoerotic feelings, which everyone has, would be terrifying to men, whether they were or weren't what we would call gay, if the state was doing that, and that you would want to, inevitably a rigid structure of masculinity, of straight masculinity, would arise that's so different from what came before, in which there are all these things that used to be part of human experience, and men used to do them, like have sensibility and care about art and care about aesthetics and care about fashion and so on. And now you're not allowed to do that because someone might think you're gay. That really kind of crystallized in this period. And I certainly believe that the trauma of the state invading the body was part of it. Now, moving to the current moment, one absolute takeaway in the book is censorship doesn't work, right? This is basically a history of censorship. It doesn't work. People were going to jail for writing about same-sex intimacy. Gay people are still with us, right? Censoring those texts did not get rid of gayness or lesbianism or bisexuality or fluidity or any of the, variations of human sexual desire. We stamped out, Annie Besant was convicted, although she never went to prison, but she distributed a book about contraception. Writing about contraception was illegal. That didn't get rid of contraception. Sending contraceptives through the mail became part of prohibited by the Obscene Publications Act and subsequent laws. That didn't get rid of contraception, right? You don't get rid of anything by not letting it be said. It is, to this day, the ALA has a section on banned and challenged books, and they're disproportionately, every year in America, books that showcase LGBTQ relationships in a positive light, especially for young adult readers or young readers. Those are the ones that are challenged. Is that going to get rid of a single gay or trans or, gender non-binary young reader? Not one. It will just make them struggle more to censor those texts.
So almost maybe make them want to read it more, in the sense of that whole idea of something that's forbidden or something that's banned makes it all that more tempting to figure out, oh, well, what's wrong with this? Why can't I have it? I think about in the fifth Harry Potter book, when they ban the magazine in it, and Hermione's all excited because and Harry's like, what do you mean it's banned? And she goes, oh no, it means everyone's gonna read it now. It was the ultimate publicity, because it's this sense of forbidden and not allowed, which adds a certain level of intrigue to it. There's a play, What the Constitution Means to Me, that has the line, banning abortions didn't get rid of abortions, it just made them more dangerous. Right. And it's the same type of thing that you're talking about here, but I love the simplicity of censorship doesn't work. That's a very just simple, easy, concise way of putting it.
Right. So unfortunately now we're being hammered, unfortunately, by the left, and I say that as a member of the left, to ban speech, ban offensive speech. I'm worried about, I don't like offensive speech, but I see what happens when you give the state the power to say who can say what. And I see, really scary laws in America. Even with the First Amendment, there are these laws that we read in I have a company that explains legislation to people, and there are all these state bills that make it illegal to criticize Israel, right? And you can't get a state contract if you've ever criticized the state of Israel. So, thank God for Tattered cover, and thank God for booksellers, and thank God for the First Amendment. And we're in a very sensitive and fragile time for words and ideas. And one of the things I've been calling for is we need to understand how, digitization can be an invisible censor. I mean, I don't have to go down that rabbit hole if we don't have time, but, basically Google can decide what you see and won't tell you what you don't see, right? Search results will show you what the search results want to show you, what they've tagged on the back end to reveal to you, and you won't know what you're not seeing. I mean, this is what Aaron Swartz, really lost his life to kind of break apart. And so as more and more of our looking at books is digitized, whether we're scrolling through Amazon or, looking in a digital library while we're all locked down, this is a very dangerous thing, because a book of what I've been calling analog spaces, right? We can't lose them. Physical bookstores, physical libraries, right? Physical archives. I've written about how more and more archives, like the National Archives, are being bought up by for-profit third parties that have no obligation to present them completely like, museum curators or archivists would. Their obligations to their shareholders. So huge swaths of our history are at risk. And the only way to avoid that form of censorship is to support analog human spaces and go to them, even if, like, literally, even if you can only spend 90 minutes in the Tattered cover. And I don't live in Colorado, so I'm like, what the F is that? You know, that's not epidemiological, that's just weird, right? But anyway, even if that's the restriction, even if you have to, you know, go with a mask cover and it's not the same, go support these analog spaces, because they will not survive this great crackdown, driving us all, you know, with a very real medical crisis, driving us all into digital reality. And the danger of everything being digital is that there's censorship you can't even see. So that is my riff to you about the danger of contemporary censorship. And also, please, like, don't call for censorship, fellow members of the left. Just don't. Like, take a, you know, glass of wine and have a deep breath and listen to things you really don't want to hear, you know, and get used to it, because that is how we save democracy.
And so I want to turn it over to our audience members who have questions and who may want to ask. And so one of the first ones that we've got here, I think, is a really good one of, other than visiting analog physical bookstores, what are other things that we can do to combat censorship? And I think that's meaning like more on an individual level rather than like, you know, we're not going to solve all the issues right here in this interview, but, you know, what can individuals do?
Right. I mean, that answer, thank you so much for that question. That answer really depends on where in the world you're located. And the magic of this digital platform is we're talking hopefully to people all over the world, or in the future they can, you know, watch this video. But the things you have to do are different in different places. If you're in Canada, I would say resist and lobby your representatives to resist the criminalization of hate speech. And I know that that's a really unpopular thing to say or hear. I hate hate speech, but I promise you, and you'll be convinced by reading Outrages, these techniques are always the camel's nose under the tent, meaning they always start with, well, hate speech is really bad, or, you know, it's really bad, you know, racist speech, really bad, anti-Semitic speech, really bad, right? But the minute you have that law where the state can punish you for violating that speech, I promise you, and Outrages will persuade you, if I don't in these few minutes, that the state will quickly move on to banning criticism of the state, or creating such a vague definition of what hate speech is that it just chills speech. And the state loves to chill speech because that chills dissent and organization about absolutely everything. And what's happening right now in this gigantic medical crisis is that while we are locked down and at home, it opens up the opportunity for all the stuff to be stolen and reallocated without any citizen oversight. And speaking as a political consultant to both Clinton and Gore, you know, real crises also always have a throng of special interests that want to get in there and get the stuff before people can come back to the town halls, can, you know, lobby their members of Congress face to face, or, you know, join in a real protest. And that's what's happening now. If you're in the United States, I would say a lot of this is debate. If you're on a college campus, which no one really is except virtually, but even in discussion, you know, try to push back against people aligning to deplatform, right? To deplatform speakers. You know, even if you're the only person in a group of people who are really mad at you, and social media really amplifies the madness at you factor, it's scary, right? Try to be strong, because, you know, they always start with the outer fringes and then they come for you. But also, you don't want to live in, like, we're so lucky in America with the First Amendment. You don't want to, I've been all over the world. You don't want to live in countries that really have chilled speech. Like in Australia right now, they're really cracking down on speech. And people are scared. And I'm getting DMs from people saying, I really want to speak up against what's happening. You know, they're tearing down the koala's habitat, but I'm scared to speak, right? That's what comes. First, they're like, don't say mean things to immigrants. And the next minute, you're scared to speak up for the koalas, right? I like literally it's that fast. So don't do that. And what else can you do? I mean, really, a lot of it is economic right now. Pay for news. right? It's so tempting, it's so seductive, to get all your news from free news outlets and websites and Twitter and Facebook. Don't do it. You get what you pay for. It's hard. Sorry?
Especially local news.
Exactly. Thank you, McKinney. Exactly. Local newspapers are dying. That's intentional. They've been driven out. Like, I really see a war on independent thought entities and independent bookstores, independent publishers, independent commentators. There is a war, and it's very well organized. And the goal is to crush competitors, but also to hegemonize messaging and thought. So pay for your local news, donate to people who are doing real reporting online that ask you to donate to them, subscribe to them. But also, I'm going to say, really question this erasure of analog spaces. Like, there is no epidemiological reason not to have a town hall meeting in a tent, like an event tent, like outdoors with heaters. There's no epidemiological reason, not to gather safely, in a bookstore for a human event. And what I'm really afraid of is that we'll lose the habit and instinct of human gathering, and that radical act of running our hands over a shelf full of books and finding one we never even knew about. And the last thing is, when you see an influencer targeted, don't lose your critical faculties and do what you can to even support that influencer. For example, this book, Outrages, has had an extraordinary journey. It was canceled last year. I did make two mistakes interpreting two cases, as I mentioned. And of course, you always want a book to be perfect. But what happened after that was that not only was canceled, but a letter went to librarians to destroy this book. All right, not shelve it, not to return it, to destroy it. And then something really interesting happened to me in the book at about the same time. After the first wave of, as I mentioned, often erroneous reports erasing real atrocities in LGBTQ history, there was a launch of a critical blog about me in the book from Breitbart. That's where it came from. And then we used a University of Indiana bot identifying tool, and it turned out that all of these bots were unleashed, and human trolls from right-wing networks, white supremacist networks, Christian fundamentalist networks across the Southeast, aimed at me and at Outrages. And I don't really believe that, a random white supremacist really cares that much about a dead gay poet. And then the other amazing thing that happened was that Russia, where I've never been, was lit up, every time Google Trends showed my name in the book trending. So I've seen the same thing happen now with a number of different influencers. People like Michael Mann, who called attention to climate change. People like Marianne Williamson, who risked kind of derailing the anointed candidates by being a persuasive candidate for, calling for like peace. This incredible manufacturing of, reputational attacks, and it is a digital phenomenon, and these are contracts. Like, basically, these influence campaigns can be purchased, and then AI and machine learning directs these bots at you, and the trolls get activated. The right-wing trolls in my case, and in the case of Michael Mann, fossil fuel trolls, and so on. And that's what's going on in what we want to believe is a free and open social media environment of debate. So it happened to me. I survived it. The book survived it. But it's a terrifying thing to be in the middle of. And other people might not understand what they're facing. Another interesting book this happened to is Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe. Pardon me, not as well known here as in Australia, but it's a very persuasive alternative history of Australia, of Aboriginal civilization and culture, that kind of totally challenges, as my book does, the received narrative about, how it was an empty continent before the English colonizers came, just as my book honestly challenges very exhaustively, and, citing very distinguished LGBTQ scholars, challenges the received narrative that you and I both were taught, that there was nothing much wrong with how people of sexual minorities were treated or how speech was treated in the 19th century in Britain. So those are some ideas of what you should do.
I think that's great. And I feel like that there's so much more to learn here, and that people can do that by, going back and listening to the talk and taking notes, but also reading the book, going online and purchasing Outrages at tatteredcover.com or coming into one of our locations. You can get your copy today. I think this is a really great question here to end on, because you've done such extensive, wonderful research on this. What's next? Do you have another project that you've become obsessed with? Is there something that sparked that kernel of interest for you? You've done such great research here and really gone through the gambit with this book. But what's next? Or are you just kind of letting it be and being like, I did this one thing, I need a break?
That's another wonderful question. Thank you to whoever asked it. It's a very compassionate question. Well, I do feel like I'm in the middle of trying to get this book to readers in a very weird time. Mm-hmm. So any support, like you, I'm going to humble myself and, ask people, don't just order the book, but please, if you like it, write an honest, or if you don't like it, write an honest review on Amazon or Goodreads, please. And share it. If you can't afford to buy another copy or ask your friend to buy another copy, ask your library to order it. I'm actually driving around the country delivering donations of the book to certain libraries that have requested it, because I feel so strongly that they were asked to destroy it last year. So what is next? Well, honestly, I've been really thinking a lot about this erasure of history. So what was going to be next is a book called On Heart Island, about how sexual violence kind of conditions every aspect of women's lives and professional lives and imagination. However, the current moment we're in and the response to my explaining the erasure of history and how digitization is kind of dangerously trying to manage all knowledge and mediate all of our relationships, I may write a quick essay about this very moment and the perils. There are worse things, believe it or not, than a horrible pandemic, and that is living in a police state. That is actually worse, because they can kill you anytime they want, and they can kill your spirit, even if they're not killing you physically. And someone, just like at the end of America, someone has to put those pieces together and kind of remind us, there's going to be a moment when this pandemic is over, but will we still have freedom? That may be my job next.
And I have to just say, good for you that you are taking these passions that you have and pursuing them in the face of any kind of adversity, and that it takes real bravery for stories of all kinds to be told. And so thank you for joining us today. Thank you for continuing to write, and thank you for, just pursuing your passions, because we wouldn't have books, period, if authors didn't still decide to pick up the pen. We wouldn't have anything to sell. So we thank you for your time. And I want to just remind everybody once again that you can get Outrages at tatteredcover.com or in our stores, any one of our 4 locations in the Denver metro area here. But Naomi, I want to give you a minute to close us out, remind people who you are and where they can find you online.
Thank you. So I'm Naomi Wolf. The book is Outrages, Sex, Censorship, and the Criminalization of Love. My website is drnaomiwolf.com. And I cannot thank the Tattered cover enough. I can't thank you enough, McKaylee. And like everyone, wrap your arms around the Tattered cover and hug it tight, because it is a precious being in our midst, in our community.
And if for some reason you're in a local community and you want to support and stay local, you can always go to indiebound.org and search for your local independent bookstore, where you can buy things from there. And it's dinner time around our nation here for a lot of people, so maybe order from a mom and pop restaurant down the street or something like that. So continue to shop local, support local businesses. We really appreciate it. We would not be able to continue doing what we do without you. My name is McKaylee. I'm with the Tattered Cover Bookstore. And Naomi, if you'll just stay with me here for a moment as I close out. Thank you guys for joining us. Stay safe, everybody, and happy reading. And we're